I'm going to talk for the next 5 minutes about some of the research that I've done in the last decade or so and focus on political extremism, political violence, especially in the American context, and especially with regard to the American far right, which is, again, an area of research that I've focused on basically for the last decade. And what I'll try to provide you is some kind of an overview of the landscape of the violent American far right and how that may impact the ability of the American people and especially minority groups to exercise their human rights and their civil liberties. We can start by, for example, mentioning the fact that if we're looking at far right violence in the United States for the last 30 years, we can clearly see that usually the level of violence rise as we are getting close to elections. And we see that really consistently, basically since the early 90s. That means that as we're getting more to election times, the environment is becoming more contentious. The competitive nature of these periods are empowering people and legitimizing people to engage more in violent activities. But most importantly, because of the increasing polarization of our political system and our society, more and more Americans sees elections and electoral processes as a zero-sum game. And when you believe that you are in such a situation, you are willing really to go very far in order to ensure victory to your political camp. And that leads more and more Americans to be willing also to exercise violent practices in order to promote their political views. What is really different in these elections in comparison to past elections is the fact that in the past, usually following the elections, we've seen some decline in the level of violence, decline in the number of hate crimes and similar acts of ideological violence. This time, I'm not sure that this will be really the case, mainly because this is the first time in which major political leaders actually try to undermine the democratic process and try to delegitimize the electoral process, which can cause further erosion of people's trust in our democracy and less willing to accept the results of the election, something that may encourage them to engage in various types of acts of political violence. So this is something to keep in mind, something which has a direct consequences when we think about the ability of different groups to exercise their rights to participate in the political process. So when you hear rhetoric talking about, for example, about the necessity to deploy polling sites watchers and so on, these are related directly to this kind of discourse that delegitimize the electoral process and eventually may impact the ability of minorities to exercise their voting rights. Another trend that we see when we're looking at the changes in the nature of the violence that is produced by far-right groups, such as white supremacists, neo-Nazis, skinheads, and so on, is the increasing number of attacks against religious sites and the increased usage of religious rhetoric in their propaganda efforts. I think that many of these organizations, many of these groups understand the unique psychological and symbolic impact that they can maximize by attacking a temple, a synagogue, a mosque, a church, and so on. You have to remember that these religious sites are not just a place of worship, but also the hub of the religious community. This is also the place where they gather together for cultural events, educational events, and a place where they can really manifest the solidarity of the community. So attacking these kind of sites really have an impact on the community and facilitate fear and concerns within the community and can really erode the solidarity within the community. So we need to understand that these growing attacks against religious sites by neo-Nazis, by skinheads, by different types of far-right groups have a direct impact on minority groups, religious minorities, ethnic minorities, and eventually their ability to feel included in our society and to be able to exercise their civil liberties and so on. Another prominent target of many contemporary far-right groups are the LGBTQ community members. So if in the past, that group, this community was not the main target of most far-right groups, today this changed, and we see that there's a dramatic rise in the number of attacks against LGBT targets. And this is, in many cases, we assume is a backlash against their the progress that the community was able to achieve, such as the gay marriage decision by the Supreme Court and so on. And this backlash, I think, represent an attempt by these groups to try to prevent from LGBT to be able to exercise their civil rights. So we can see that when looking at far-right violence in the US, we see how that the violence is directly trying to undermine the ability of specific groups in society from able to exercise their rights, something which was always part of the agenda of far-right groups that, as you know, one of the previous panelists mentioned the fact about the necessity of remember the relationships between outsider and insider and out groups and in groups. Mainly these groups, through their violence, they try to instrumentalize their violence in order to express their views of who are part of the in-group, who are part of the nation, who should be legitimized as members of the nation, of our society, and who's not. And they do that through their violence. Also, we see some really interesting trends when you're looking at the discourse of many of these groups. And just to, as a side note, it's important to mention that most of the discourse of many of the far-right extremist groups currently is happening online, in the cyber domain, which allow them to gain significant reach and to disseminate very effectively their ideology. On the other hand, it makes it easier for us as academics who are studying these groups, but also law enforcement, it makes it easier for us to monitor and to survey and to examine the rhetoric and the discourse that they are developing and utilizing in order to promote their objectives. Okay, so I'll do it fairly quickly. So in the past, for example, most of the traditional white supremacy groups focus on rhetoric that emphasize the need to maintain, quote unquote, the purity of the white race, of the Aryan people, and so on. Today, for example, they adopted some globalist universal sentiments, and they're talking about the need to protect and to promote a universal white male Christian culture. So despite the fact that they are very nationalists in their essence, they also try to present themselves also as part of some kind of a universal culture. We also see increasing in the usage of a male supremacy rhetoric, something that they feel is a very effective element or effective mechanism for mobilization.